This is a production of Cornell University.
Good afternoon, SEPA, and welcome to our Thursday afternoon colloquium. My name is Matthew Mornick, and I'm pleased to introduce our guest lecturer today. Today's lecture is called, they'll take it from here, the MCC and the Implications of Country Ownership. The MCC is the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is a U.S. government corporation that reduces poverty in countries around the world through economic growth. Now, Mr. Jason Bauer is the director of the Private Sector Initiatives team, and as such, he serves as the vortex between private sector organizations and firms and on-the-ground, in-country special interest groups, community organizations, and general counsel offices. So his team primarily focuses on creative ways to encourage corporations to spend their corporate social responsibility funds and increasing private sector investment and trade through MCC-inspired programs. He has worked extensively in South and West Africa. He recently returned from Ghana, and before the MCC, he worked with a small consultancy in South Africa. He worked with the World Bank on microfinancing projects for small and medium-sized enterprises, and spent 2.5 years in Benin, Africa, with the Peace Corps. So please take a moment, turn off your cell phones, close your laptops, and give a warm welcome to Mr. Jason Bauer.
Thank you for the introduction. It was very kind, and thank you, Tom, for inviting me here. I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss MCC, how we do business. Can you hear me fine? Yes? Yes? Okay, good. How many of you know what Millennium Challenge Corporation is? Okay. Enough don't that I can go through the first part of the presentation that I drafted and give you a little bit of an overview on MCC. And then I want to talk a little bit about our model and some of the challenges and the policy implications, as a lot of you are going to be entering that field of working with our country partners to the extent that we do, and some of the challenges that that poses to us. So, and that's why the title, they'll take it from here. I think you'll see that MCC really has a unique operating model in international development, engaging country partners and putting the onus and responsibility on them much more than anybody else that I've worked with. We'll see how we can fix that. But so MCC, as you rightly noted, is a U.S. government corporation. Now, it says corporation because we have a public and private sector board, but when the chair of your board is the Secretary of State, now Hillary Clinton, and the co-chair is the Secretary of Treasury, and you're funded by Congress, and I'm a civil servant, I don't feel very much like a corporation. I feel like a U.S. agency with a lot of people who have some private sector experience, but still, we're very much U.S. government. So I want to make that clear. We also only focus on economic growth, reducing poverty through economic growth. So there's a lot of development assistance throughout the U.S. government, humanitarian, disaster assistance. We don't do that. We leave that to other folks who are better situated to do it. And I'll go through how we do that. There are 3 core principles that's guided MCC's work. We're only 5 years old. We're not that old. We were created by the Bush administration 5 years ago to deliver aid in a different manner. And it was based on these 3 principles. First is really that policies matter. That if we're going to give large grants, which we give to countries, that we want to make sure that there's the appropriate economic environment, political environment, to support private sector-led growth. We give large grants to countries, but we want to see an economic rate of return. We're not asking for the money back, but we want to make sure that that money is wisely invested to bring the private sector along. We also, and this is what we're going to talk a little bit more about, believe strongly in country ownership. And I'll just leave that one for now because we'll talk more about it. I really think those top 2 are extremely innovative in development practice to the extent that we do them. Other institutions do, but we take it to another level. We also have clear objectives and accountability. A lot of development institutions, multilaterals, AID, DFID, and all of that, do a lot of that too. We do a lot of it up front. They're learning from us, we're learning from them. So it's a core principle, but it's probably not as innovative necessarily as the first two that we'll talk about. And I'm going to flip back and forth between the next two slides because I said that we work only in places where we think there can be an economic rate of return on our investment. So how do we do that? Each year, countries are ranked, they really rank themselves based on their performance against their peers in certain policy categories. These are the categories, and these are what we call our indicators. So 3 broad categories. You see the 3 bands here: ruling justly, investing people, and promoting economic freedom. That's where we get the data. So each year we have a lot of folks crunch these numbers, develop means, the midpoint for this data. So all low-income countries are ranked against their peers on how they perform on civil liberties. And it doesn't come from the State Department, it comes from Freedom House. They're rather independent. Girls' primary education comes from UNESCO. Regulatory quality, days to start a business, comes from the World Bank Institute. So we're not picking our friends. We're asking that countries perform better than their peers to qualify for MCC funding. And as you see, some of those indicators are green. Maybe they look a little more yellow on that slide. And some are red. So in here, Malawi, they were just named eligible by our board. They select countries each year. And they passed this past year and were named eligible because they passed 50% of the indicators in each broad category and all the categories. And then they passed a hard hurdle, which is control of corruption, just barely, but they did pass. Niger, so they're eligible for a compact. The compact is the large grant agreement that we sign with a country, and you'll see the sizes of those, and we'll talk about that. Niger is threshold eligible. That's a smaller program, probably $5 to $50 million. The compacts run up to $700 million, so there's a big difference. And that's run by USAID, and so there's a program in Niger to help them pass that control of corruption indicator, because they're close, they're 42%. I don't know the rest of their scorecard, but that's a hard hurdle, so they need to pass that to become eligible for MCC funding. And I mentioned country ownership is critical. We don't go in and tell countries what they should do with the foreign assistance money we're giving them. We ask them, what are your challenges, what are your constraints for economic growth? Write those up, consult with your civil society, private sector, government entities, and come back to us with a proposal that we can fund. So, I took that photo on the left in Namibia, where they actually went around the entire country. Which isn't necessarily what they have to do, but it's what they wanted to do to create enough buy-in for their proposal, which is a program that looks at education, tourism, and livestock. That's what they told us. They told us a couple other things too, but we do some due diligence, make sure that it makes sense, it's going to have that economic rate of return, and some of those projects didn't. So those were the ones that came through. Now, they also have to implement these programs. So again, it's not the model of us sending big teams of Americans or international consultants on the ground. It's actually Ghanaians in Ghana who are managing the $550 million program. We have 2 people on the ground in MCC. We travel a lot. We do a lot of due diligence, make sure your taxpayer dollars are being spent wisely. But it's not Americans down there managing the contracts. It's Ghanaians really building capacity. And I'll talk more about that. Again, I talked a little bit about how results matter. And there, okay, I lied. It's $547 million. Still quite a bit of money. But those are the types of targets that we look at. And if we're, say in year 2 or 3 of the compact, the large program, and we're not seeing the productivity and harvest, or maybe we're not seeing enough on one of the indicators on land disputes, then we may move money somewhere else because we want to see results for the money. We don't want to keep pumping money into a program that's not showing results. These are the countries where we signed these compacts, these 18 compacts, a lot of them in Africa. Some of the early ones, Cape Verde, Nicaragua, in the $100 million range. Some of the later ones, Tanzania, Morocco, Burkina Faso, $500 to $700 million. We'll probably be around $300 to $500 million, I'll say, in the future. And this is the type of stuff that countries are asking us to do, a lot of infrastructure. It's been neglected for a long time. in developing markets. All the PPPs that came around in the 90s, and then you had the Asian crisis, and they all cratered. And so people were very wary, and development organizations thought it was much more interesting to do training programs, technical assistance, capacity building, and a lot of infrastructure hasn't been financed in these economies for a long time. So that's what they're asking us to do. So you see a lot of transportation, that's roads, airports, seaports, a lot of agriculture, but a lot of that's irrigation, a lot of that's hard investment, water supply and sanitation, as well as some energy. We certainly will do health and education as well. We encourage countries to look that way as well because there are economic rates of return to those investments, but we don't tell them that's what they have to do. You can look at this one later, but this just kind of shows that we're pretty broad. Again, it's low income and lower middle income countries in which we're working, and they're at different stages. Some are developing these compacts, some are implementing, some are in that threshold program by AID, some are in both because they've straddled and they've kind of quote unquote graduated. Some are suspended. I worked on the Gambia and Namibia when I first joined MCC, and we suspended the Gambia from the program. That's a big loss for a country. They had some serious decline in political and human rights. And we couldn't say with a straight face to the Ghanaians that we're going to give money to this government, and here you are making all these hard policy decisions. That's kind of how the final decision got made in that one. It was very interesting. So normally I would stop here for questions, but I think I want to go into this country ownership because it might preempt some of the questions, and then we can have a holistic discussion about MCC. If you want to, talk more about MCC, we can talk about what I'm going to lay out a few of the core issues on country ownership that we struggle with, for which I don't have answers, but want to hear what your good ideas are. We're recording it, so I'll take them back to DC. Okay. And then my job actually is to work with the private sector, as was mentioned earlier, trying to bring them more involved so that our programs are really leading to private sector-led growth. So we're not just trying to do a supply push in agriculture, but make sure that the people that are buying are actually going to buy the products that the farmers are going to be growing. Or that if we are doing a lot of infrastructure and rehabilitating a port, it's not the U.S. government just buying the entire thing, but taking our money to leverage debt and other equity financing and bringing the private sector in these economies in a meaningful manner. That's what I do. But I know a lot of you are public policy students, so what I'm going to talk about now are things that if you work in our policy group, and I liaise with our operations group that actually developed the compacts, and that's where I came from, but I'm actually in our policy group. So we think about these things like country ownership, and it's very, very important to us, but we have different interpretations, and it's a spectrum. So let's talk a little bit about that. When MCC got started 5 years ago, it was right at the time of the Monterey meetings and then the Paris Declaration. And the Paris Declaration, laid out some key objectives for donors as they're working in these developing countries. And, the first one is country ownership. And it's funny, I met somebody from the UN a few years ago in Rwanda, and on her card, she was the harmonization officer for East Africa, which I thought was a very interesting title. And now it all makes sense, but she was there to harmonize, everybody all together. Interesting job. But you see some of the things that, and you can see how MCC, what I've been talking about, came out of this. Country ownership is a principle of ours. Aligning, if we're asking countries what their priorities, then we're aligning with their development strategies, right? We're not just looking at their development strategies and lobbing on to them. We're asking, what are your priorities out of your development strategies, which are usually, like Santa's list. And then harmonization, again, if you're working with these countries and they're implementing the projects, then you should be harmonizing with the other institutions. They're the ones managing relationships with donors. We do some of that too, but they're the ones, their Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Planning is doing that. So you can see how that kind of informed a lot of MCC's work. These were indicators of progress, and I had to look up some of these as I was developing this presentation, but as I did, I looked at them and said, that's MCC. Operational development strategies, we asked them for proposals and then asked them to implement, so you can't just say you want this. You have to show us how you can implement this program. Country systems, If it's Ghanaians, we're not necessarily going through the Ghanaian government, and I'll show the structure, but it's Ghanaians who are implementing these projects. So I think we're using country systems to some extent. We're aligning to their priorities. Aid is more predictable. MCC is different from many other donors, especially the bilaterals, less so the multilaterals, but the bilaterals are usually subject to annual budget appropriation. So if you're going to go out and work in government, you might say, you know what, here's our 5-year, $50 million program. At the end of the day, that might be a 2-year, $8 million program because your yearly budget appropriation changed, the people changed, your administration changed, your boss changed, and so priorities changed. And that's really hard when you're a developing country and you've got these large amounts of money coming in from donors, and you're not sure if they're really going to be committed for the full 5 years, $50 million. So MCC's money, all that $6.2 billion, it's sitting in the U.S. Treasury. We get special money. We get what's called no-year money. So they know that even if MCC were to go away or get merged into AID or the State Department or something else, that program's going to continue. All that money is there for that country. That means a lot to them. It's also untied, which is important. USAID, for example, is not untied. It's U.S. contractors that have to do the work. They usually get some local partners too. But we're completely untied. In fact, it's a hard conversation for me to have sometimes with U.S. firms because I don't see them picking up as much of the work as they probably should. It's a different business model. They can't come to Washington and lobby me and my peers for contracts. They have to go to Tanzania and talk to the Tanzanians that are managing the programs. Firm I used to work for did that, but for a lot of companies, that's a different business model. And I think it's good to get them out there. A little bit of how we work. Again, I'm just trying to set the scene for how all this country ownership, and we'll get to the issues. So if you can just bear with me through this background, it will all come together, I promise. Countries named eligible. They're in the compact implement or development stage. They give us a proposal, and we sign the compact. That's a 2-year process typically. It's a long time. And then we have 5 years to implement the project. So we develop some country ownership because very early on, we do due diligence on what they want to do. So we step back a little bit. We start telling them about, the M&E targets, the governance, accountability, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But in terms of what they want to do, that's up to them. And they do what we call a constraints analysis and a sector analysis. So we try to give them some tools to help them think and structure their thinking. So I was a strategy consultant. That makes a lot of sense. We're kind of building some capacity, giving them management tools so they can make informed and good decisions. And then this consultative process I talked about in Namibia when they went all around the country and engaging civil society and the private sector, that's all country ownership. So everyone's going to have a voice if that's what the country wants to do. The implementation, as I mentioned, we are government. So it's MCC signs a compact, that legal agreement, with the government of Ghana. Then the government of Ghana assigns its rights and responsibilities to implement the compact, the $547 million, to an accountable entity. MCA Ghana, we'll call it. For consistency now, we're asking themselves to all call themselves MCA blank. It's just easier for us. And then when we're trying to message with partners in the private sector, we can say it's MCA Honduras who's implementing the program, or it's MCA Lesotho. We'll put, we have some oversight responsibilities, but it's up to that accountability to produce the results and spend the money and execute the programs. And that requires a lot of work for these guys. So this is what we ask of them. That MCC rep, there are 2 people on the ground, 2 Americans that are providing oversight. A lot of people coming through, doing checking and things like that, but there are 2 people on the ground. So it's up to that, is it 40, 50 people maybe in the MCA entity? It depends on how big the program is. We hire a fiscal agent and a procurement agent. So that's, making sure if you're doing a 5-year program in infrastructure, you got to get the procurement right. And if you're going to work for government, you're going to learn all about procurements. And you're going to learn how important it is to do them through all the guidelines that whichever government you're working for has in place. And if you blow one and you're on a strict timeline, you could crater the entire project over a failed procurement. So we give them some expertise there. Also a fiscal agent. But they're the ones who manage the projects. So I said in Namibia there was an education project that might go through the Ministry of Education. It may go through another implementer, NGO perhaps. maybe the livestock project goes through the Ministry of Agriculture, or maybe, it's one of the more development consulting firms that you know about that have done agriculture programs. Or a roads project could go through a contractor, could go through a Bechtel or somebody else. But it's the Ghanaians that are managing the project. Now, we try to work in countries where corruption is minimal, but we still make payments directly to vendors if they can receive them. And we're quite aware of the environments in which we're working in. So the vendor submits a receipt to the project manager. It goes to the Ghanaian counterparts. They check it. The fiscal agent does, and then MCC, the U.S. Treasury, actually pays them directly. Or if they're local, it'll go through a local bank. But we're not putting money through. That's the one thing on the Paris Declaration that I mentioned earlier, the country systems. That's where countries push back a little bit because they wanted to go through their systems completely. We prefer that it goes directly to the vendors. If you're a U.S. taxpayer, you might prefer that too. So I'm going to go through some of our stakeholders because that's going to kind of set the stage of kind of some of the issues that we're dealing with. So we have our board, which I told you about. They approve the compacts. They make the major policy decisions. Are we going to suspend this country? Are we going to stop funds because, we've stopped paying contracts. We've stopped signing new contracts in Nicaragua right now because of what's going on there. They'll make a decision in March of what to do there. They make those level decisions and provide some oversight. And as I mentioned, look at that. That's Hillary Clinton up there. That's a pretty powerful personality to have, whomever it is. They have their sets of priorities. You have U.S. Congress who approves our funding. So we can't, do our work meaningfully if we don't get funding, and they're doing oversight. And then you have these MCA-eligible countries. Those 26 countries that I mentioned, those are all political relationships too. It's usually we're talking to the president, prime minister, and then they appoint somebody. And that person usually reports back to a prime minister or a president or a special cabinet council. It's usually all of the above. So that's a very challenging relationship to manage. They develop the proposals, they implement the compacts. Then you've got NGOs in the private sector, and they're looking to benefit. And I don't mean that cynically. I'm sure some of them want to win procurements, but if we're reducing poverty through economic growth, shouldn't we be producing opportunities for the private sector to actually come in and buy from farmers or use the roads and the port and make investments in these countries? So they should be aware of those. You also have some NGOs, who have historically received a lot of money from U.S. agencies. They haven't received so much from MCC, and I wonder with a new administration, where NGOs might have a little more influence with a Democratic administration, how that's going to play out. We're all interested in seeing. So I wanted to go through 3 kind of issues or implications and lay them out, let you think about them a little bit, and then maybe tell me what some of your thoughts are of how we can manage these issues that we go through. Because if you're going to be working in government, in a policy shop, these are the types of issues that you're going to have to deal with, and it's a lot of relationships. So it said that we asked countries what their priorities are. So they've said large infrastructure programs and ag. I went back and read something by Gail Smith, who advised Obama. She and Aaron Williams advised Obama on the transition team for USAID, MCC, and PEPFAR. And right when MCC was being created, she said MCC should be focused on health and education and agriculture. And now we're doing large infrastructure projects. That's not what people thought, necessarily. It's what some people would have told you, but it's not necessarily what some of the founders of MCC thought. So what does that mean? Well, for our countries, it's very attractive. If we're going to give them hundreds of millions of dollars, nobody else is going to do that, and then not put strings on what sector that it's going to, then they're going to give us the roads that nobody else wants to fund because they want to do the more interesting stuff. But it's extremely important. It's been neglected. And then, as I mentioned, it's been neglected. It is a long-term investment, so it certainly makes economic rates of return. So that's what they're choosing, and that makes a lot of sense. Now, in Congress, there's a lot of support for the ag programs. Sometimes you can get some wins with the ag programs, right? You're training farmers, they're increasing productivity. Maybe some buyers come in the market, some things happen, some deals happen, and that looks great. And I've done that previously, and you can do that. The infrastructure, though, remember I said that we have all that money in the bank, in the treasury, and we tell Tanzania, here's $700 million. Because we're different, Congress looks at that $700 million. That's for Tanzania for the next 5 years. And it's, an infrastructure project. So you do a little bit for the first couple of years, then you spend a lot of money, right? So the first couple of years, they're thinking, $650 million. You've only spent $50 in year one. We'd really like to get our paws on that. And so we have a hard time messaging, that, in fact, that money's all called for. We're kind of running out of money for committing for new compacts, and it just takes time for these infrastructure. But Congress is short-term. They're used to annual appropriations. They don't like to see taxpayer dollars sitting in an account somewhere. So that's an issue. I don't have an answer for it. It's just an issue. And then I said NGOs and the private sectors. USAID, has just been earmarked to death almost. So, and it's always good things, right? You can't argue with a few $100 million of food security when there's a food security crisis. You can't argue with it. But it happens a lot in a lot of different sectors. NGOs and others work with officials to earmark. And so USAID may get billions of dollars, but a large majority is earmarked. That has to go to health, that has to go to education, and it'll drill down into exactly what it needs to go into. And we don't operate that way. So I imagine that there are some groups that have probably successfully done that with AID that probably aren't too pleased that they can't do that as much. We tell them to go to our country partners, but that's a very different conversation than doing it in Washington. And again, those NGOs that have been working with AID or some of the DFID, the other international agencies, they don't do infrastructure projects. That's Bechtel, that's GE, that's these huge infrastructure firms. So I think again, this is my personal opinion. It's not the MCC official opinion, but I think they may be asking some questions. So we'll see how it goes. So it's just a relationship. I don't have an answer, but when you ask countries what they want to do, and you respond to that, this is what has happened over the past few years. We have to manage all these expectations and relationships. Then there's pace of progress. $700 million in Morocco is going to be a challenge to spend, period. You hear it a lot in development. You hear of absorptive capacity. It's not just the economies. You can go through the economics of the economies. No, I'm just talking about people with skills to actually get the job done. There's a dearth of talent. We're trying to build the capacity through our business model in many respects, but that takes time, and it kind of takes a recognition that is in fact what's happening. So we're trying to do that. We're trying to have varying levels of oversight for countries. So if they start doing a good job, we can back off. We've only got now down to about 250, 260 people in Washington. 260 people, maybe 40 in the field, so 300 MCC employees overseeing $6.2 billion. Now, I didn't do the math for AID, but I guarantee you the ratio is going to be a lot different for AID. So it's a big responsibility that we all have, and that'll come to another issue. So we have to decide where we can put our time and resources in country oversight. We have to let some countries move forward because they're doing a good job. Of course, the MCA entities, they're benefiting from capacity building, I think. They really are taking on these challenges. They don't have to, but they are taking on these challenges. And we're trying to provide them more training expertise on management. We just approved some large capacity building programs broadly for MCC to help them just in how you run a little business almost. But of course, I think Congress is a little frustrated at the pace of implementation. Remember, MCC was started 5 years ago. It's not easy to start a $1 billion startup. You think you just have the money to do everything, but you've got to spend the money, and you've got to set up these systems. Ask Gates Foundation how well they're doing on spending a few $1 billion, and then have it be taxpayer dollars, too. So it's very challenging. So, and then you have these large infrastructure projects. So we look like we're going very, very slowly, and Congress looks at us, come on, spend that money that we gave you, or we're not going to give you any more. Well, what do you tell Jordan, who's got a project here? We say, sorry, Congress isn't going to give us money until we spend what we had. That's an interesting conversation to have. And then finally, and this will give us a good half hour to talk, who's accountable for the results, really? I mentioned that was one of our principles, right? I mean, accountability for results. But really, who is accountable for those results? Is it the people in MCC, the headquarters? So we're getting, we've got these disbursement targets now. I told you, we're responding to Congress. We are looking at making sure we can get money out the door, is what we're calling it, trying to get these MCA entities to spend the money, because they really do have to within those 5 years, or it stops. And if they haven't spent it, it's gone. So if I'm a person at MCC being measured on these disbursements, then I feel very accountable for that program, even though it's not mine necessarily. It's our MCA countries. But I've been thinking, and again, these are some of my thoughts. I wonder, what are the long-term consequences of not meeting the results with these folks? Is it they don't get the next job, or they do get the next job, or are they just thinking about the current job? I don't know. I think they very much feel that these are their programs. In Ghana, it's, when I am working with a large fruit buyer and trying to get banks to lend and move with our programs, it's not me leading the conversation, it's my Ghanaian counterparts, and I'm there just to, provide a little oversight and talk through the issues that they're going to have to approve and decide. So they should be the ones, right? Well, and then you have Congress who's saying they want tangible results. So, you've got this pressure from Congress again to spend the money, show results, but you've got people at MCC, you've got a group who say, well, it's our countries, and if they fail, then that's okay. If development had been working for the past 40 years, there weren't fits and starts, then we'd all be developed and we wouldn't be here today, right? So as part of it to say, well, it's up to our country counterparts, and if it doesn't happen, that's okay. That's really hard to say to someone at MCC who's working on that program day by day with their country counterparts and feel passionate and committed to these programs, and then are getting measured on, whether or not the program is successful by their superiors or Congress or somebody else. So again, I don't come with a whole lot of answers on these questions, but I felt that, because again, I work in trying to bring in the private sector, and that's a different conversation. And if you want to ask questions, I'm open to that. But if you're public policy students and you're going to work in government, you're going to have to manage all those relationships. Well, at least in my role. If you go work for the Department of Commerce or the Department of Labor or the State Department, you're going to manage different relationships. But you're going to manage relationships within your government, within different branches of your government, with external stakeholders, with external governments, most likely. And these are some of the issues that come about just because of our principle of country ownership. We could solve, if we wanted to, we could take it all on us. We could get those programs done, spend the money, no problem. But we believe so strongly in country ownership that we're willing to go through all these issues and explain ourselves to Congress, our counterparts, the private sector, NGOs, other agencies, the State Department, Treasury. We're willing to do all that because of how strongly we believe in country ownership. So that's all I have in terms of a presentation. And, if we want to take questions, we can talk about MCC. We're going through an interesting time in foreign assistance. If you want to talk about foreign assistance in the U.S. government more generally, happy to do that. Happy to talk about MCC. Happy to talk about this country ownership and what your thoughts and ideas are. What will your answers be? Let me know. I'm interested in hearing. And then if you want to talk about how we work with the private sector. So that should be a smorgasbord of questions.
We saw a question over here.
Yes. Out of curiosity, you said it was difficult for countries sometimes to spend the money and you have to kind of get on them like, hello, you got to spend your money. Could you give a concrete example of what that's like? I just find it hard to believe that a country that needs infrastructure or whatever and has a plan and a proposal would then have difficulty spending the money you gave them.
Well, it's in the complexity of the projects a lot of times, you know, and it's having to work within their own country systems that can be challenging as well, that might be less developed. And so, you know, a few more bottlenecks just getting through the things that you might take for granted here in the U.S., spending that level of infrastructure money. It's also, quite frankly, that their capacity. They may not have managed programs this large and understand the complexities in writing a scope of work for a contractor for a roads contract that then has to go out on the street, you know, through that procurement agent and be responded to appropriately. These are very, especially for the road, these are very complex and sophisticated contracts, and it takes a lot of time. And then they have to sit there and they have to evaluate the contract. So you've got to get the MCA entity, who's had some varied experience, evaluate the contract and make an informed decision, and then give that back to the procurement agent. And then they've got to manage the contractor once they come on board. So they may not have managed these types of contractors before. You know, it's AID is so adept. They've managed these Chemonics, the DAIs, those types of contractors out in the field. Our country counterparts necessarily haven't managed those types of contracts. So they get, you know, some issues happen. The contractor says, well, that's not in my contract, but we're getting measured for that on the compact. Well, you should have put it in the contract. You know, we're going to do this. And so then they go back and forth, and that takes time. And the next thing you know, you got 2 years left, and you've got a few $100 million that you still need to spend. Now, I'm making it out to be dramatic, but that's what can happen. And imagine then if it's a world-class roads contractor or managing a water sanitation program as well. And then it's their money, but it's U.S. taxpayer dollar. So of course we want oversight. We don't want any of you to get ripped off. So we're coming out and we're checking, and they've got to check in with us and provide us all of our requirements, monitoring and evaluation of the programs. So you're implementing the program, then you're monitoring the program at the same time. It's very, very demanding work, especially when you're talking about this level of funding. Yeah.
In terms of accounting to Congress for all your slower pace of expenditure and preventing them from taking your money away, I was wondering how much of a chance MCC gets to justify the level at which these projects go, and kind of do you get to show them the expenditure projections for the future, where this cash is going, and do you get to show them that 5-year plan so they can see, I guess, the money will be spent just on right now?
Yeah. It's a constant education campaign that everyone would. The question was with Congress, do we get to explain ourselves? It takes a long time, and the pace of progress is slow, and Congress is frustrated. And can we explain to them what I just explained to you? Certainly. And we do it all the time. But, there's a lot of members of Congress. And each member of Congress has a staff of a lot of people. And so, we're 250, 300 people in Washington. We do it with our board. We bring them projections of disbursements, and we show what happens in an infrastructure project. And sometimes we are behind. Quite frankly, sometimes we are very behind. And it's just the way we're learning with our country partners. We're not going to get it completely right. We're going to make mistakes. I'm so glad Obama said we can make mistakes in government. I'm going to hold him to that one. So we do that. And I just saw a presentation the other day that our compact implementation team gave to senior management, which I think is going to go to our board, so all those secretaries. But I don't know. I think it's going to take a long time. I just think we're going to have to be able to do it more efficiently. I don't think that you can explain it to that level of satisfaction. I'm just a little pessimistic on that.
Right here, please speak up.
Hi. You alluded at several moments in the presentation about the changing administration, and I'm wondering, as such an agency, what do you see as the future of MCC as far as international development is concerned for the U.S. government?
She wants to know if I'm going to have a job next week. And I hope so. It's interesting. It's interesting. So MCC was a Bush initiative, right? But the type of work that we do really does cross party lines. I mean, this is important to a lot of people. What I can tell you is that a lot of people have been writing a lot of papers the past few years and thought this was the opportunity, right? They were building up some momentum in the think tanks, from what I could see, of ways to harmonize, remember that one? Foreign assistance, and rationalize and coordinate, and let's look at the DFID model with a secretary of development, or let's put a czar of development in the National Security Council, the NSC. There are all these proposals floating around there. I think people have other things to do right now in the administration, but those people are going to keep moving. That's what they do. They're going to keep moving that. And I don't know what the answer is. I know that AID is going to get a rethink on how to give them more resources and more professionals. I don't know if it can happen. I don't know if the budget's there for that to happen for AID. But I have a good friend who just joined their policy group just because he thinks it's the right time. Like if anything's going to happen to AID, it can be now, and he wants to be a part of making it a better organization. And and Hillary Clinton, the secretary, went over there just a couple of weeks ago because morale has been very low there. MCC, I don't know. Should we be part of AID? You'd have to change our legislation to do that because we got this corporation in our name and this public-private sector board. So you can't even merge this into state without legislation, even though the secretary is our chair. So I don't know. They'll have to go through. Do they want to reopen the entire Foreign Assistance Act of 1964, which gave rise to AID and its way of being, but has devolved. I don't want to say it has evolved and devolved on different planes. So I don't know, but I think that the principles of MCC will endure. I know that that's important. I know that when the transition team came to us, we didn't beat the drum and say you need to keep MCC in existence. We really said these are our principles, and we think they're really important, and this is how we try to operationalize those principles. So I don't know. We're still waiting. A lot of people are waiting at their agencies. Our CEO left because he was a Senate confirmed political appointee. A few other people have left and are leaving. So I'll be very interested to see what happens because everything I just talked about were these large compacts between the U.S. government and another government, and then that other government does everything and spends the money. We actually have the legislative authority to grant money to subnational governments, so municipalities or provinces. We have the ability to give grants to NGOs and to the private sector. And we're not doing we're doing one out of the 4 mechanisms that we could actually use. Maybe somebody takes a look at that. That could be something that changes, that makes us, seem different in the future, but not lose MCC. I'm going to let you choose.
Let's go in the back.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sir, for sharing your thoughts on the MCC. My question, I'm originally from Ghana, by the way.
Great.
And my question is, in terms of countries that don't yet qualify for your program, is there a program that the MCC has in working with them towards at least falling within the threshold or becoming eligible for the compact?
There is. It's the threshold program. So what you said the name right there, and I took that slide out of my basic presentation because I wanted to make sure we saved enough time. But so when I went back, let's go back. I didn't keep my backup slides, but actually this one shows some of those threshold programs. I think in beige in some of the eligible countries: Peru, Paraguay, Niger, Uganda. But Niger can be the example here. So we name countries eligible for the compacts, the ones that are close, and it doesn't have to be in corruption. They could be close in girls' primary education completion, which is something you can get done in a few years. You can see some impact rather quickly in that one. Or immunization rates. That's something you can influence relatively quickly. Rwanda is actually tackling some challenging ones on the top line. Not many people go outside of corruption on the top line. That's a little challenging for a government to do. to say that it wants to work on voice and accountability in its society. That's a very interesting conversation to have with a country. But those are administered by AID. So we fund them, and we have a few people at MCC who manage those programs, but it's kind of the typical AID delivery mechanism. So that money, I think, is tied to U.S. contractors because it goes through USAID. They're shorter. They're 2-year programs. So the compacts are 5 years. Those are 2 years. And it really is, like you mentioned, it's very focused on can we move that control of corruption from 42% to 52% in 2 years. And designing a program, and again, it's the same concept of country ownership. We don't tell them that that's the indicator you have to do. They come to us and say, these are the indicators we want to work on. These are the programs that we want to do. And we go through and just vet them to say, okay, that makes sense. If it's the girls' primary education completion, it's got to make sense in terms of making sure that girls are completing school. It can't be tangential. We want to make sure that it doesn't have to have an economic rate of return, but we know these indicators really well, and we know what types of programs will move the needle from these institutions.
In terms of economic development, do you feel that there's a difference between encouraging foreign firms to enter countries versus having, say, Ghanaian-owned firms? And that kind of leads me to my larger question, which is, why not do that? Or maybe you do. Invest money into startup firms as opposed to having maybe foreign firms.
No, I think those are great questions, and they're things that are near and dear to my heart. So the first one, foreign firms, and you phrase it more as an either or, but let's think of bringing them together. So when I was just in your country, it was with a large fruit buyer and marketer who was looking at sourcing from Ghana a product, a very important product for Ghana, to the European market and making that the sole source for their operations coming into the European market. Now, what I really like about this company is they don't go in and buy plantations. They buy from farmers. So they take ownership of the product there, so there's no risk of transport for the Ghanaian farmers whose specialty is growing the fruit, not transporting the fruit and marketing it. So they guarantee a price, take ownership there, but they buy from Ghanaian farmers. So they're evaluating Ghanaian farmers. I'm trying to see how we can be supportive of the Ghanaian farmers so that the foreign company will come in and pull that product through rather than us just building the capability of the farmers, but then not having the marketing outlets. Now, Ghana's got some very savvy business investors. They just got back from Berlin. They're selling those products. They're doing a good job. But this would take it to another level. This would increase all of their capacity. And so we're working with the local banks to provide some credit enhancements, perhaps, to a funding facility. So there's the local banks. We're already helping the farmers with some training, some infrastructure investments through some leases, but we're not granting them money, so there's got to be some sustainability. And I'm trying to work with USAID so they can get involved in the party too. So we're collaborating. We're not, as U.S. government entities, so they can bring some more experts in from this company to help train the farmers. And then you asked about startups and funding local startups. The hardest thing there is getting that through Congress. I think it's a great idea. There were a lot of enterprise funds that were done in Eastern Europe 10, 15 years ago, I think. There's Poland, Bulgaria. I went to a presentation about them that assessed their effectiveness. And a couple of them were, but a lot of them weren't. And Congress is very, very wary of those types of funds. Now, that being said, what's really interesting is I was pushing for the same model at MCC just last year when I was doing this private sector initiatives toolkit of how to get the private sector involved. And I mentioned this because DFID does it. The UK does this through what they call challenge funds. And I sent this idea out, and we drafted it up, and we went to our vice presidents, and we had enough development economists that said, no, we don't want to give money directly to the private sector. We just want to do public goods. So it got shot down. Well, it's getting resurrected now. So now we're going to make another run at it. But it's something that I think is going to have to go to Congress for them to kind of look at Even though we've got the legislative authority, it's a touchy subject. So I believe strongly in it, but I think the U.S. has been burned in the past by it, so it'll be hard for us to do, but it's the right thing to do. Yeah.
Professor Shorten?
Follow-up question on this. If somebody's going in and building a major road network or is building an airport, does the host country or your process require them to hire local companies or regional companies, and is there a negotiated percent that you guys try to put in place? Because in some ways that's training developing companies.
Right. That's one of the more challenging conversations that we have with countries, because we were set up as untied aid, which is extremely different for U.S. government. So we say we give no preferences to anybody. We don't give preferences to U.S. firms, but that means, to keep that constituency appeased, we can't give preferences to local firms either. And countries don't necessarily like that. That's another, relationship of the. It's not a country ownership relationship, but it's another relationship that you have to manage, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I worked in Namibia, where there was a lot of apartheid. So not only is Namibia Africa that has suffered from lack of investment and lack of growth, but it was effectively discriminated against until 15 years ago. So you would, if you're going to make that argument somewhere, that probably makes sense. But that's not. We can't do that. We can't give preferences to the local firms. We can do a program, and we're going to do it in Namibia, that builds the capacity of local firms to partner with the large companies or to work directly. But we'd rather do that on the side than give preferences to local companies. And that's different than the World Bank, because the World Bank does give local preferences. So we operate a little bit like the World Bank in our procurements, but that's the major difference. And it's a no-win situation. I have local firms come in and say, and I just like to get the U.S. firm and the local firm and just let them go at it for a little bit. Yeah.
Right here? Yeah. My question is kind of linked to that.
Yeah.
So the bulk of the projects under the impacts are in the infrastructure category.
Right.
So are only the development economists to be blamed for that, or is it because of the reason that most of the capabilities under the infrastructure belong to the U.S. firms, like even best vendors or builders would be from here? I'm just trying
in fact, this is being recorded, rats, but I'd be ashamed to say, I don't even want to know the percentage of U.S. companies that are doing our work, because it's small.
Okay.
To be perfectly honest, it's small. Because I think it's a new business model. I think they have to get out there and really sell themselves to these countries and not to U.S. government folks. I think it's a different business model. They're starting to get it, and we're trying to get the word out through the Foreign Commercial Service Office, not to advocate, but make people aware of these. So it's definitely not that, because there's not a lot of U.S. road contractors that make a lot of money building a road in Burkina Faso. There are local and regional and African companies, or even Chinese companies, that can make a profit doing that, but U.S. companies really can't make a profit doing that type of work. That's the better question, is who might be winning some of these contracts. Is it the development economists? Not entirely, because I do believe that this has been, if you're asking them what their major difficulties are, and you've got a few $100 million to bring to the table, and they haven't seen their roads rebuilt in so many years, then that's what you're going to get. But I also think some of it is our influence in saying we want to do public goods rather than funding private companies, which we have the legislative authority to do, but seem to be very hesitant to do. So it's a confluence of things, but it's certainly not the U.S. road contractors. Yeah.
So I've been studying climate change a bit, and thus I have a question regarding that. I know that a lot of countries, at least on some level, are concerned about climate change and resiliency to climate changes, especially in terms of agriculture. So is that something that ever comes into play in terms of the scorecard or any kinds of environmental indicators that you might use?
We just... Whoops. Oops. Oh, there we go. All right, we'll restart it. Great. I don't know what feeds into that natural resource management indicator, but there it is, so I can ask you to look that one up. the thing that climate change, where that conversation has actually been had, is more in carbon credits and trading and things like that. That's something, but it's a really touchy political issue to deal with, and different administrations think differently about it. So we've steered clear. It was going to be, along with those challenge funds, that was going to be another thing we wanted to propose to our country partners, but just weren't quite comfortable doing. Certainly we have rigorous environmental standards. If a country proposes a dam for us for funding, they're going to wait many years to get that funding. There was a rumor of a nuclear reactor in one country. But you can imagine that these large infrastructure projects have a lot of environmental. So but that's not exactly your question, I know. But that's one thing that we're doing. The ag, and you're asked more of responsiveness to a changing climate. So perhaps your ag mix needs to change over time. I honestly don't know where you would go to project out accurately what's going to happen in Tanzania over the next 10 years to advise a farmer who has been growing one thing all their life. I don't think so much that we do that. It's kind of what they have now and what they can do to build competitive advantages in those agricultural value chains and how we can alleviate their bottlenecks, rather than trying to predict what global weather patterns are going to do to their microclimate.
So you had mentioned that funding has been increased for capacity building activities. Mm-hmm. What does that look like? Is it the host country counterpart that facilitates these, or your field workers, or do you contract those as well?
We've contracted out, and it just started happening, and I haven't been so close to it. But I think they're going to do a lot of work in Malawi. It's funny, I actually had one of the largest education providers come to me and say we'd like to get involved in building capacity of government officials in countries in which you work. So I'm going to run it by our CEO and see if it makes sense, even though we've already done this procurement for contractors. But I think it really is in the management of these programs. And I think, but I'm not entirely sure, that Malawi will probably be one of the first recipients. They were named eligible about a year ago, so they're just getting a proposal to us. Some countries move slower or faster than others. And I think we're going to be looking at setting up all those systems, so they can spend the money, so they can have everything all set up to spend that money and start training people in how to manage these types of contracts and these types of projects. So I think it'll be, firms that have been contracted by MCC to go out there and build that capacity.
So all the capacity building is tied to the infrastructure projects?
No, I'm talking about the accountable entity, that MCA entity that has, an ag project, an infrastructure project, and an education project all under their purview, but are acting, as a 50, 40, 60, whatever this, number is, person team managing that development project. So it's managing a development project. Now they're going to have to manage contracts as well. Some of them will have to be learning how to read, assess, evaluate contractors. Other ones are going to have to learn about, funds flow, or monitoring and evaluation at the economic level, not the output level. So I could see it being a lot of things, and some of it will be, just for their CEO and their deputy CEO or their other folks that are just managing. So they're managing teams, and perhaps they haven't managed teams before. So what type of leadership ability do they have? How can we increase their effectiveness working with teams? Which I think will be challenging when you're talking about different cultures too.
So one of the first countries that was accepted under the MCC was Namibia?
Pardon?
One of the first countries that was accepted?
Uh-huh.
So
Cape Verde.
Cape Verde?
Mm-hmm.
So can you give us some sense of what types of private sector engagements have taken place in Cape Verde, or developing, or you can choose your country that you're most comfortable with, Ghana or Namibia or whatever. But just to give us kind of a sense of kind of some specific things that happened with the private sector engagement.
Yeah. I've honestly focused a lot of my work on that compact development side of it, because I felt when I started this small group, we're only 3 people now. I hired a boss, and then I have somebody working for me, which was interesting to hire your boss if you could ever do that. Because then they kind of feel like they work for you for the rest of the time. But I've been focused on the compact development because I saw all these programs kind of already fixed and just kind of moving through the economy and not as responsive. If all my colleagues are focused on spending money and getting the programs done, they don't have a lot of time to do this add-on working with 3 people. I thought, where can we really make the most development impact in the organization? And being a strategy consultant previously, I thought if we can get into that compact development space and get countries thinking differently and our counterparts thinking differently of the private sector and getting them to engage with the private sector, we can build those things into the process. So we drafted a toolkit of how to do, if you're going to do all this infrastructure, then how do you bring in public-private partnerships? The real financial ones, not soft, CSR, but real financial public-private partnerships with equity and debt. How do they do that? So we worked on that in compact development. And then, we did come back into implementation. And Ghana has kind of been the forerunner there in setting the stage of what we want to do there. It's providing that example to senior management of this is how you can take what we're doing. It's challenging because the program's moving through, and I've got to go out to Ghana with many of my colleagues to try to restructure and work with our partners to restructure it a little bit, just a little bit, but enough that it takes time so that this fruit buyer comes and engages with all these Ghanaian farmers. So we're trying to develop a strategy there. Again, we're only 3 people, and the guy working for me focuses a lot on those PPPs. But again, I'd say that's the shining example, but it's not even consummated yet. It's still a concept. It's still people talking about it, which proves how hard it is and how difficult it is in these economies and all this stuff I talked about with what's else is going on with the program, to then talk with a private sector partner and bring them along for the ride. And they may have not ever done that before with a development partner.